Welcome to the 8th and final episode in a Legendarium series about the Wars of the Roses. In this installment, The Birth of Tudor England, we will talk about how Henry Tudor consolidated power and created England's most iconic dynasty. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII of England on October 30th, 1485 at Westminster Abbey, about 2 months after he killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Before then, Henry Tudor spent 2 months consolidating support and planning a coronation before Parliament could come into session and start meddling in the succession. As king, the Archbishop of Canterbury styled Henry VII, by the grace of God, King of England and France and Lord of Ireland. This conveniently ignored the fact that Henry only ruled England entirely. The English only ruled the southeastern coast of Ireland and the city of Calais on the French side of the English Channel. Regardless, upon his succession, Henry became entitled to bear the royal arms of England. King Henry VII also postdated his coronation to the day before the Battle of Bosworth, August 21st, 1485. By doing so, he could declare all lords who fought for Richard III to be traitors, impose heavy fines upon them, or even seize their estates. On January 18, 1486, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of King Edward IV, marking a symbolic reunion of the houses of Lancaster and York. They were third cousins, both being great-great-grandchildren of John of Gaunt, uncle to King Richard II. Rather than keep the Lancaster name, Henry created what would become England's most famous royal house, the Tudors. Though the iconic red and white rose badges of the rival houses were only one of several sigils used during the wars, he combined the two to create the Tudor Rose. Even after his coronation, King Henry VII still faced serious problems. First, he had few loyal followers in England, having spent much of his adult life in exile. King Henry VII responded by forming the Privy Council, staffed with close advisors who owed their appointment to him alone. Mostly staffed by attorneys, the Privy formed a number of committees tasked with governing England under the king's close supervision, of course. With their aid, Henry crushed a minor anti-tax rebellion in Cornwall during 1486. Henry faced a more serious challenge that same year. The Yorkist Earl of Lincoln sought to reverse the verdict of Bosworth by arriving in England at the head of a mercenary army recruited from Germany, Switzerland, and Ireland. The impostor Lambert Simnel marched at his side. Lincoln had crowned Simnel King Edward VI of England in Dublin just a few weeks earlier. On June 16, 1487, the 8,000 Yorkists took up their positions on Rampire Hill to await the arrival of the slightly larger royal army of Henry VII, under the command of the Earl of Oxford. The battle raged on for 3 hours. Unable to retreat due to the surrounding River Trent, the mercenaries had a choice between victory or death. When the Yorkist ranks finally broke, the royal troops pursued them into a ravine, today known as the Bloody Gutter. There, the royalist troops put the Yorkist rebels to the sword. With almost all of the Yorkist commanders killed in the battle, the future of King Henry VII's rule and his Tudor dynasty became secure. The impostor Lambert Simnel went to work in Henry's kitchen to learn some humility. To convince the world that his regime change had been rightful and legal, unlike the equally obvious regime change of Richard III 2 years earlier, Henry Tudor set out to convince the world that Richard III had been the embodiment of evil. John Rouse, a historian who fawned over Richard III during his reign, suddenly wrote that Richard had been born stunted and distorted, murdered his own wife and Henry VI, and spent 2 years in his mother's womb before being born with hair and teeth. This Tudor propaganda made its way first into the histories of Tudor England and then into the plays of Shakespeare. The Bard, in his play King Richard III, made the late king one of the most infamous monsters of stage and screen, gleefully concocting a series of fiendish conspiracies and executing diabolical murders to achieve power. To be sure, Richard's probable murder of his nephews made the job of Henry's character assassins all too easy. By presenting himself as the man who liberated England from such a monster, Henry VII made the Tudor regime legitimate. So, how did the Wars of the Roses affect England, beyond giving us one of Shakespeare's greatest villains? For all the upheaval, the Wars of the Roses did not make England into a cemetery. Armies tended not to stay in one place very long, no commanders used scorched earth tactics, and the wars mainly involved nobles and their armed retinues. The Wars of the Roses saw fewer than 24 months of actual fighting over a 30-year period. Sometimes the lords dragged local people into the conflict, especially if nobles formed militias from their estate workers, but this tended to be the exception. Because of this, the nobility was hit much harder by wartime casualties than the kingdom at large. The number of aristocratic houses in the kingdom fell by half over 30 years. This was in part because the medieval custom of ransoming prisoners gave way to the harsh reality of dynastic war. If a dynastic rival fell into a lord's hands, he probably wouldn't let him or her walk away. At the end of the wars, Henry VII benefited from this much reduced nobility. The crown became richer from confiscated lands taken from extinct noble houses like Warwick, Clarence, and Gloucester. In addition, Henry ensured that only the crown could raise armies, he limited the number of retainers a nobleman could employ, and he kept aristocratic houses from making powerful alliances through marriages. To keep the money flowing in, Henry VII imposed loyalty fees and fines for families he judged suspect, either because of past or present deeds. Furthermore, he used Parliament to pass a law requiring that all nobles show proper papers for maintaining castles. If they couldn't produce the original order, which could date back to William the Conqueror 400 years ago, the castle had to be abandoned. In short, as England entered the modern age, the great feudal lords might keep their land and manor houses, but they could only challenge the crown in their dreams. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.